Welcome to Breadcrumbs, the podcast by WorkSync. I am here with a great group of people. Could you please take a minute to introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Keith Richter. I'm a product owner here at WorkSync.
Good afternoon, Joe Thompson, product manager with WorkSync.
Good afternoon, Ben Lagden, commercial director at Groven Technology, GT Clocks here in the US, manufacturer of time clocks.
So Ben, tell me about GT Clocks.
GT Clocks are a time clock manufacturer. We've been around a long time, over 30 years manufacturing. Originally time clocks with like punch cards and through to today touchscreen devices with biometrics, allowing employees in the workplace to not only punch in and out, but to perform many of the self-service time and attendance functions they might need to do. Book leave, change rotas, view time cards, attestations in states such as California, everything that's needed to for them to perform their normal job function, but also for the business to ensure that they remain compliant with current legislations.
So I think it's safe to say that this group of people knows a little bit about biometrics. And that's today's topic. So let's get into it. Tell me a little bit about the history of biometrics in timekeeping.
Who's going first?
Let's start with ancient Egypt.
I think biometrics have evolved to identify people, and I think the use of them within timekeeping specifically is to prevent payroll fraud, where people are punching each other in and out. So it's a natural evolution for those technologies to ensure that the person present is the person that should be present and to prevent fraud. So that's how it started. Technology started with hand geometry, where it measures the actual geometry of the whole hand, which was a good start. It was relatively inaccurate. You would usually have had to have the person identify themselves first. You have to tell the machine who you are. And all the way through to today with some of the more modern technologies like facial recognition, which is becoming part and parcel of everyday life through the airport and in other uses on your mobile phone, for instance. So it's a natural evolution, really, but ultimately to identify people to ensure the person present is the correct person.
I like that you're saying identify because with the hand punch, for the longest time, you had to verify who you were first. And so that kind of technology had to overcome that aspect of it. And the accuracy of it wasn't that great. But if you're only comparing the first image to today, it was a lot easier to handle it with the older technology. But things have evolved quite a bit over time.
You know, and the technology has evolved now into facial recognition, iris, which we'll get into later. But, it's come quite a long way where, people can walk up to a time clock. And in this day and age with pandemic, post-pandemic, wherever we're at, people can walk up to a time clock, not touch it, be recognized, be punched in and handle all of that. So, it's saving, hopefully, time with employees punching in quickly, but hopefully not missing out on sync leave also because they're not actually touching anything physical that everyone else is touching.
So that actually gets right into my next question. So I think sometimes the term biometrics, evoke certain images. Keith, you had mentioned a couple types of biometrics, but maybe we can discuss a little bit more about how they work.
Well, we'll start with one that's been popular lately during the pandemic, facial recognition. I think you're all kind of understanding what that is. It doesn't just take a photo and compare it to a photo, but it actually takes measurements and points on the face and then compares that to what you've already saved. And that's been pretty big lately, mainly because of what I just mentioned. You can walk up to the clock, be recognized, and be punched in without touching the clock. There's also finger reading. That has come a long way too. I was one of those people that could not be really recognized by some of the old finger readers. And where the finger reader technology is today, I don't have that same issue. So, right now I think those are the two biggest. There's also iris, which some people really enjoy. Not a big fan of it myself.
I think a lot of what distinguishes different biometric options is how invasive they are. When you talk about facial rec, as you're walking down the street, how many CCTV systems are capturing you? How many cameras in the world have a picture of you? And how long have employers been taking pictures of their employees? Which is a whole lot different than your fingerprint or capturing an image of your iris itself in your eyeball. It's probably the least invasive. And it's funny, the hand reading technology, everyone always thought it was more invasive than it was. Employees thought it's getting your palm print. Is it connected to Homeland Security? Is it measuring who I am? It was just taking a picture of the top of your hand. There was more illusion to how secure it was than reality. But the least invasive, but also has been working really well for us, has been the facial recognition.
And I think how invasive it is directly proportional to have the acceptance by the employee to use such technologies. And once they realise, as Joe's just said, that your face is being captured every day by CCTV all day long, and so therefore it's just a natural extension of the technology like face rec to be used and could be used in those circumstances. When you use things like iris, then that's a different thing. People are less likely to want to give up their personal data, the PII, for things like iris and even fingerprint to some extent. However, the technology that we implement in the devices themselves, no image is ever kept of any finger or any face. It's always a mathematical representation of that finger, a mapping of it, and it's only ever used to compare that person to themselves for the purpose of identification. So once people realise that, it's much more likely that they'll accept the technology, which is, a factor to adoption. People need to have to accept it and understand how it works and understand how the data is going to be used. And we'll come on to privacy concerns later, but there are many aspects to that.
It really doesn't live up to the television show that shows the fingerprints going whizzing by like we're going to find this criminal. It is a lot more boring than that. Like Ben mentioned, it's more of a mathematical thing to get to that representation. We'll capture another representation later and see if they match up.
So let's talk a little bit about securities and some other common misconceptions that we often hear about. Joe, you sort of touched on it. So what are some common misconceptions that you hear about?
One of the ones I heard out in the field, which I thought was rather humorous, is you're not sharing these pictures with any law enforcement agencies or anything, which I was like, absolutely not, but it made me suspicious of that person at the same time. Like, I wonder why you're worried about that, but, like Ben said, they're just keeping that mathematical equation so we can recognize you the next time you step up to the clock. It's not something, we're not going all meta on everybody and sharing all this information. We're using it just to recognize employees so they can start their workday.
But it's not like the camera didn't catch them coming into the building. What the camera didn't catch coming into the building is their iris or their fingerprint.
So we don't need to worry about biometric timekeeping or clocks capturing your information. It's really cameras, security systems put in place by your employer.
We do have to worry about it a little bit now because the laws are popping up that are ensuring people's biometric security. And so we've been able to rely on a really valuable partner in our business relationship with GT Clocks to help us incorporate facial biometrics along with some really industry-leading security management of everything that's coming in and out of those terminals through their platform.
Yeah, so GT Clocks is very concerned with helping their clients stay compliant. So tell me a little bit about the things that you look for.
Well, I think legislation is what it comes down to, and the evolving state of that legislation against why some of that legislation has been put in place in the first place, and the perception that this is, law enforcement type standard of facial recognition where everyone's being monitored. What we're talking about here is people consenting to the use of these biometrics for the purpose of time and attendance. And it's only happening when they approach a device under their consent. So privacy legislation in the US has evolved. Many states, including Illinois, with the Biometric Information Privacy Act, basically the right to class action for not following these rules can be very costly. Statutory damages of $5,000 for each willful and or reckless violation. Statutory damages of $1,000 for each negligent violation. Many examples in the industry of some big numbers. Six Flags, $36 million. Walmart, $10 million. Topgolf, $2.6 million. So this is a big thing. So what do we do to help people and businesses remain compliant and give people that and employees that level of trust that this has been done correctly? So we take care of consent for the biometrics being taken. We make sure that and so they are consenting to their use for the purpose that they're being used for a period of time, and that retention period is strictly adhered to. They'll be reminded to reconsent. They'll be deleted if they do not reconsent, or they leave the business. Also, encryption is part of this legislation, so we have to encrypt the templates at rest, so they are secure and they can't be broken into and used for other purposes, and in transit, and when they're stored in any software system. So all of those aspects are taken incredibly seriously by GT Clocks, and we implement the latest technology in order to secure these devices.
You mentioned templates, and I think for those following along at home, that's going back to that mathematical representation of what your biometric really is. Well, it breaks down into a much smaller template than it does a picture. But it's got to be interesting to watch from the UK as we are or are not evolving in 50 different places in the US on this legislation, whereas opposed to where you have to deal with in the EU with GDPR and the kind of things that are happening on your side of the pond.
The basis for the legislation is slightly different. With GDPR, it's about the lawful basis to collect the data in the first place, and that must take precedence. Here, a lot of the legislation is based around consent mostly, but we're seeing that actually filter across, and more of the proposed legislation is of a GDPR style. So that will become more prevalent. It's an exciting subject we've got. Mathematical representations and law.
Yeah.
So let's talk about considerations. If you're a client and you are presented with a biometric option, how do you determine if it's a right fit for you?
I think environment is key. I mean, finger biometrics have come on so far compared with where they were, and they will deal with pretty much all environments. That said, if someone's working down a coal mine, they shredded their fingers, or or they're not following usual PPE practices in those environments, then fingers can get damaged, and that might not be the best choice for that environment. That's where facial biometric might be more. And facial biometrics might not be suited to being outdoors or in very changeable light environments and that sort of thing. So really, it's down to the implementation teams to really advise correctly for what the best biometric solution would be in any given circumstance. And there's always a good fit. It's just about identifying it correctly and putting the right recommendations in place.
So tell me about what's coming next. We talked a little bit about history of biometrics. How is this technology improving, and why?
Well, there's always value in making sure that people punching in are who they say they are. One of the things I remember in this industry 22 years ago last week was seeing a poster on the wall of a guy fly fishing, something Ben's into, and it said, "Thanks to buddy punching, so-and-so's making $20 an hour to fish." And it really hit home, like, this is a problem that some organizations do have to deal with. If you're expecting someone to be at a place at a time, and you can't necessarily ensure that by spot checking, you want to be able to rely on a biometric to say that they really were there. So there's value in it. So why to continually improve it? There's value in it, and there's value in it working well. Like Keith was talking about with the onset of the pandemic, facial recognition became a touchless way to confirm your presence at work, and that was really important to a lot of our clients.
And, even with facial recognition, employees always find a way. It's like life from Jurassic Park. It finds a way. They started trying to use pictures up in front of the clock, and obviously there's spoofing methods we can enable so that they're unable to do that. But employees always are finding new ways to try to punch in for their buddies because, hey, if I punch in for you today, you can punch in for me tomorrow, so I can make $20 an hour, fly fishing. So it's constantly evolving to try to figure out what they're going to do. It's like almost, the white hat hackers. What are the hackers going to do next to try to beat this, and how can we beat them? And it's constantly something we're always considering to help our clients out.
Yeah, employers have to be on the watch for these scoundrels.
Well, and speaking of which, Keith was a prime example of a person who could not use a fingerprint scanner, and just with this last iteration that we've been working with GT Clocks, they're able to finally read his fingerprints. And there's various reasons that people's fingerprints aren't readable. Like Ben mentioned, certain vocations will cause people's fingerprints to be worn down. Keith doesn't remember the 90s, but whatever organization he was a part of, they burned his fingerprints off, we're pretty sure.
Witness protection. Can't go into any more detail.
But the technology is advanced, so now you can't hide.
You can't, and it's funny because everyone was so skeptical over these new finger readers when they're coming out, and they're not going to believe me saying well, I can do now, I couldn't before because I'm the one trying to sell that to them. But everyone we brought in front of the newest readers are always like, oh my God, not only does it recognize me, but it's lightning fast. I mean, the speed of this technology has evolved even in the last year and a half to where, it's as quick as, going up and just putting a badge in front of a clock. So, we're saving, speeding up the process also and doing it accurate has been, huge jumps just in the last few years too.
And I think it boils down to, I think you're hitting it on the nail on the head. It boils down to four areas: is being inclusive of everyone in all of those edge cases, like you, Keith. It's about throughput, making sure it's as fast as it can be, and that really comes down to what environment you're in again. So if you're in a factory and you've got a lot of people arriving at a certain time of day, if you've got a traditional biometric solution, there may be a bit of a line, but the things are getting faster and faster, recognizing people in less than a second. So I think some of the advances in technology will be around punching multiple people with one device at the same time. And this is where some synergies with mobile phones will maybe come in. Knowing that person is there due to their proximity via Bluetooth or near field communication, and then being able to pick those people out and ping them a message, you've been punched in, so they can walk through in a high footfall environment. So these are some of the edge cases where maybe biometrics, you need more clocks, or maybe we can put less clocks in, but we can start to have a higher throughput via some of those means. The other thing you mentioned was anti-spoofing, and that's an area where GT clocks are making massive advances. Our earliest anti-spoof on the face was based around some machine learning, looking for specific things within the frame, such as mobile phones or pictures. And we're now putting much more advanced machine learning into play, where it's looking for blinking and the rate of blinking and the head position and facial expression, so it can tell that somebody really is real rather than. So those things are really advancing, and some of the next iterations of the software that we release to you guys and to your customers will be incorporating some of those advances. The third one will be accuracy. I think is important too. Any biometric has false acceptance, false rejection. So those are typically up in the 1 in a million, but it does mean that someone might be misidentified sometimes. And as time goes on, these algorithms are getting better and better, and they're getting more and more accurate, so that the probability of that happening becomes infinitesimally small. So that's the further area. So with environment, I think when you have a fingerprint sensor, it's like a little closed room with perfectly lit, with a perfect camera, and you put your finger on the thing, and it's a perfect environment. With facial recognition, there are other factors at play. There's the lighting. Are you backlit? What's the temperature of that lighting? Can that affect the contrast in the face, depending on different skin tones? So all of those factors come into play. The advances that we're bringing are camera advances in terms of infrared versus visible light to work in different lighting environments, and that helps with contrast too. We are also working to bring better exposure modes where it exposes the face. Any camera has a dynamic range. The eye is so much better than any camera, so we have to work with the technology to be able to expose the image correctly. So constantly our development teams are working and enhancing the technology to be better and better in different environments. And the latest iteration is really very good and very fast and can work in a multitude of environments.
And I do remember on one of the older iterations, I had to go out to one of the sites. It was an LTC facility. The lighting was atrocious. And, they just expected to be able to throw this clock on the wall and be able to recognize everybody. And that just isn't how this works. And there was a lot of people who wouldn't recognize it all. Other people that took a while to recognize. And we went on site and ended up, checking the lighting and everything. And we moved it to a new spot where the lighting was much better. And it was funny because even the people that it recognized prior to the move, it started recognizing everybody. But even the people it recognized before, they were like, wow, this is so much faster. Because the clock doesn't have to do as much work because the lighting's so much better. It can, click on things right away. So, it's very important. Less so with the infrared, cameras we got now, but back then it was so important where you put this clock and everything. There was a lot more thought needed to be put in. It wasn't like the normal clocks, just where are the people coming in? Just throw it up right there. We're good to go. They needed to set things up a little better for these clocks. But now with the infrared, we're finding it's almost anywhere it's good as long as, the backlighting's not too overwhelming or anything like that. But the advances have been great.
I like you brought in the infrared to it, and how that's improved our ability to find a face in environments where The lighting, while it still matters, doesn't matter as much. But that's historically been an issue with any camera. You know, we've had clients 20 years ago that they could punch in the morning, couldn't punch out in the afternoon. And those hand geometry devices were being thrown off because it was facing a west window. And now the sun's coming down and changing the image. But with the addition of the infrared to the cameras, it's made a big difference as well.
We did evaluate Palm, and we found it was not mature, unreliable at best. And why would you want to do something different? Why are we always looking for something different when we've got facial? Facial recognition is mainstream. Iris is not mainstream, you know, and people are more happy to use their face because it's about adoption. They're having their pictures taken by CCTV every single day. And let's face it, we're not trying to stop people getting into Fort Knox. We're just trying to stop people from punching in. So it feels like, why use more and more technology, more and more secure technology, when actually the best technology is what we already have.
More and more secure, more and more invasive.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you for being on Breadcrumbs. I've learned a lot about biometrics. I appreciate the time.
Thanks for having us, Kim.
Thanks for having us.